This is a Eurofar review of Caverna the Cave Farmers by Uwe Rosenberg, which is a sequel to a previous very popular game, Agricola, also by Uwe Rosenberg. I'm going to do two separate reviews for this, one for people who are new to Agricola, who haven't played that game before, and a separate review for people who are experienced with Agricola. So this review is for people who haven't played Agricola before, and I can tell you straight away that Agricola was a fantastic game, still is a fantastic game, an absolute classic, sat right at the top of the Board Game Geek charts for a long time, and still right up there. It's accessible, it's tactile, it's strategic, it's harsh, it's got a good learning curve. It's a great game. Now Caverna is essentially the same game, just with new elements added and rules tweaks here and there to Agricola. But we're going to look at this from the point of view of not having played Agricola at all. So the basic starting point for Caverna is that you've got this board here, and you have a collection of these discs which represent your dwarves. These are your workers. You can see on the board here I've got 3. Now at the start of the game my board would look nothing like this. Okay, my board would be completely empty. It would just have these forest spaces, as you can see underneath there. It would all be forest, and this mountain would be completely empty, just empty spaces like this. But throughout the game you're going to build up this whole network of tunnels and caverns. You're going to cut down trees to develop wood, to grab wood, and to build these fenced areas where you can keep animals. So we've got pigs here, and we've got sheep over here, and the sheep are being guarded by this sheepdog. We've got another pig here. We've got some cows up here in a space called the breakfast room. And in the mines over here we've got 2 donkeys. Okay, and these are all lovely little wooden pieces which give the game that tactile element that I was talking about. And it all really starts to tell a story as you go along, as you're placing these animals on the board. It's not just animals though, you've also got vegetables. So we've got these pumpkins that you can grow on the fields here, and grain that you can grow over here. All these things are going to score you points at the end of the game. You score points for most things. We've also got these different building resources, so bits of wood and stone. These ones are ore, so these are what you're going to use to build weapons throughout the game. Although weapons is a bit of a misnomer, they're not really weapons, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then you've got these rubies, which act as a sort of wild card, really. Rubies can be spent to buy most different types of things throughout the game. And then these cardboard tokens, which represent food. And throughout the game you're going to have to make sure you have enough food to feed your dwarves. Now you'll notice these dwarves also have symbols on top of them. These are their weapons that they've developed. So this guy has got a level 4 weapon, which isn't that great, but this guy's got a level 13 weapon, so he's really effective when he goes out on expeditions, which you're going to do throughout the game. So the game is about developing this board, and then at the end of the game you get a scoring pad like this. I don't want to show you my scores, embarrassing, so let's fold that over, and there we go. So you've got all these different scoring categories. Every farm animal and dog you have will score you 1 point. Any farm animals that are missing, so if you haven't got any cows, for example, you get -2 points. Every grain is worth half a point, rounded up. Every vegetable 1 point, every ruby 1 point, every dwarf 1 point. Any spaces you haven't used on the board are -1 point. And then you get these rooms. I shall move you over to the main board now. This is going to intimidate you if you haven't played Agricola before. Over here we've got all these different types of rooms, which score you points, which get placed onto your player board. This one's the cuddle room, where you can place a whole load of sheep. There's a odd little German joke there. Yeah, right, so this one gives you as many sheep as you have dwarves you can put onto this room. It doesn't give you the sheep, but you can put as many sheep onto this room as you have dwarves. And it costs you 1 wood in order to build it, and at the end of the game it's going to give you 2 points. So these are all the different ways that you can score points throughout the game. The other thing that you can do is grab tokens which represent gold. So you've got these in various different numbers. Okay, so these are just straight up victory points at the end of the game. Now how the game's going to work is when it's your turn, you take one of your dwarves and you place him or her somewhere on this board. And these are all your different options for what you can do on your turn. So for example, if I wanted to go logging, I can go here and I would take 3 bits of wood. I also have the choice, if I want to go on an expedition, but I don't have any weapons on this particular dwarf, so I can't do that. I could go here and take a bit of stone. Now wood and stone is what I'm going to need to build most of these rooms. Most of these rooms require wood and stone in order to build them, to give me points and to give me extra powers and abilities. What sort of other spaces have we got here? We've got these ones which are about developing the land. So this one gives me a bit of wood, it's a clearing, but it also gives me one of these tiles. So I'll gain a tile like this, which I can then place on my board in order to start to develop this sort of farm area over here. Okay, then there's also similar sort of things. As I said about going up here, this one would give me stone, but not only that, it would also give me a double tile here, which is going to help me to dig into my mountain and give me caverns and tunnels. Now, the advantage of having tunnels is that they, when they're paired up like this, allow me to use a space which pops up later in the game to build mines. So I can build an ore mine, or I can build a ruby mine on top of that. These give me points at the end of the game, but they also mean that when I go and gather ore, so if I take ore, I'm going to get extra ore, 2 more ore for every ore mine. Or if I go and gather rubies up here, I'm going to get a ruby, but I'll also get a ruby for every ruby mine that I have. Or, well, no, actually, I'll get 1 ruby if I have at least 1 ruby mine. Okay, now the clever thing about these spaces is they're blocked. If I take this space, the next player that comes along with his dwarf and tries to put it on this space, he's not able to because I've blocked it off. So that is the basis of a lot of worker placement games. You block off the spaces. So there is some competitive play there where you prevent another player from taking a space. And the spaces which haven't been used in a turn will accumulate more goods. So you might end up with a situation where suddenly you've got 6 wood on this space, and it becomes very attractive to take that space and take the wood off it. Okay, there's lots of other spaces, and throughout the game, each round, new spaces will be revealed. So new cards will be turned over, which will give you new opportunities to do different things. The final thing I should mention, really, I mean, the game goes on until we get to here. Okay, and between rounds, there are usually harvests between each round, and in a harvest you're going to have to feed your dwarves, so you're going to have to make sure you've got food. Your animals are going to breed. Your vegetables and wheat, you're going to start to take those off your fields where you've been growing them. So there's all sorts going on in this game. I should probably talk about expeditions. So expeditions, what you're doing here is you're taking a dwarf that you've previously given him a weapon, and you give him a weapon using a blacksmith space on the board, spending ore. So that's these little black bits, spending this to give him a weapon, and the weapons are various degrees depending on how much ore you spend. So this guy is a level 4. If he goes on an expedition, so supposing he uses this space up here, which is the blacksmithing space, well, let's look at giving him a weapon. So he goes on here, he's got no weapon at the moment, but he's got a bunch of ore. He can spend up to 8 ore, so let's give him 5, he spends 5 ore. Okay, which gives him a level 5 weapon. So we'll stick a level 5 weapon on him. He then gets to go on an expedition, and this expedition is going to give him 3 bits of loot. Now, you would expect an expedition to mean fighting and that sort of thing. It doesn't. It means you go out and you find yourself a cow or you find yourself a pig. So these are all the different things he can take on his expedition. But he can only have stuff from level 5 down. Okay, but he can take up to 3 things on this particular space. So he could have a pig, a donkey, and a sheep. Or he could have 2, oh no, he can't have the 2 points because that's a 6. He could have a pumpkin, he could have a wheat, he could have a dog. Okay, he could even go here, and after the expedition, all his weapons and all his dwarves will be given +1. And when he completes this expedition, his weapon is upgraded. So throughout the game, by going on more expeditions, you gain more experience and your dwarves get better at gathering stuff. And that really is it. There's not much in the way of interaction in the game. The only interaction is in blocking each other. It all looks quite daunting, but actually you pretty quickly get used to what all these different buildings do. You know, they're all very logical. There's one there that scores you points for stone, there's one that scores you points for ore, there's one that scores you points for rubies, there's one that scores you point for vegetables and grain, there's one that scores you point for weapons. You know, pretty much if you stick to a particular strategy, there's likely to be a tile there that's going to score you points for it. This game really, it requires you to kind of diversify and do a little bit of everything. You can specialise a little bit, you know, you could have a ton of sheep or something like that, but you're going to get scored down if you don't have one of each farm animal, and you're going to get scored down if you haven't filled up all the spaces on the board. So you're going to need to build up your mountain side and your farming side if you're going to get maximum points. The game plays for, it plays really well with 1 player actually, but it plays with up to 7 players. I haven't played it with that large a number, and I imagine it would take a long time. The box says 30 minutes per player, and I think that's fair for players who know the game. But if you're playing with new players, it's going to take even longer than that. So for a 7-player game with new players, I think you're looking at a day. So, but yeah, 1 to 7 players, which is a nice spread, and there are a ton of components in this massive box. This is an enormous box, you know, and really, really heavy. It's absolutely packed with stuff. The stuff I've showed you so far, obviously this is just 1 board. There are 7 of these for a 7-player game. Now, it doesn't come with storage solutions, so you have to come up with your own, but this is all the wooden bits that come in this game. Okay, a ton of wooden bits. This, by the way, is a box from Mayday. I got it from Board Game Extra's website. But this is a useful storage system. But that's not even enough, because we've also got all these tiles. So this is where I keep all my separate tiles to place on the board. And even that's not enough. There's a load of stuff that I couldn't fit into these containers, which are still in plastic bags in here. So, and there's extra boards here for more action spaces for when you're playing with more players, so that the board doesn't get too crowded. Okay, I can tell you straight away that this is a fantastic game, as Agricola was before, and as the other games by Uwe Rosenberg in this sort of harvest family, what used to be called the Harvest Trilogy. They're all fantastic games. But I'll talk a little bit more about why I like this game so much. Caverna is a absolutely enormous production. It's quite expensive. This box is big. Let me compare it to a more standard sized box, so the box of Agricola. Well, these are heavy boxes to hold up in one hand. So there's Agricola. Okay, you can see Caverna is considerably bigger, thicker. Okay, so this is quite an expensive game. It's well worth your investment, though. It is absolutely rammed full of pieces. The stuff doesn't even fit in the box if you use the sort of storage solutions that I've talked about, and it barely fits in the box as it comes. But this is it's value for money. You know, there's a lot of game in this box. My experience with Agricola has been that it has been a very accessible game. I've been able to play it a lot with family and with couples and non-gamers, and I think Caverna is still there. You know, this is in some ways this is a little trickier to pick up. So you know, but the theme is still very accessible. This idea of farming and a little bit of mining, but it's also, you know, bared down to its absolute sort of the simplest aspects of it. Having a mine just gives you a little bit of ruby or gives you a little bit of ore. You know, there's nothing very detailed here, but it tells a nice little story, and most of it is fairly intuitive in terms of what you do. And the other thing is, it's quite this game is quite forgiving. You know, you're gonna get points for most stuff. Most stuff can be converted into food, so you're not going to be struggling to feed your dwarves. You know, it's not a stressful game to play, and stress is something that was often talked about in the previous game, Agricola, and this is not a stressful game to play. But it is fairly complex. This is probably not a game to throw somebody straight into if they really haven't played any sort of Euro games at all. And that's what this is. This is a Euro game through and through. It's for me, this is sort of this and Agricola are the benchmark by which all other Euro games are really compared. It's a classic worker placement. I know Caelus went before, but worker placement really came into its own for me with Agricola, and this is the same game. I mean, it feels almost like this could have been introduced as an expansion to Agricola rather than a whole new game. But it's fantastic. Now, why is it so fantastic? The tactile pieces, brilliant. It looks lovely. That board, it just looks lovely when you've got all the bits building up, and you can look back and see what you've achieved. You know, and then losing one of those sheep or losing one of those cows, you know, to give food for your dwarves. That's quite heartbreaking, really, because, you know, I've built that and I'm pleased with it, and it's there, and it feels great to have it there. And then you can find ways to make points from what you've built by adding in little rooms and stuff, and that's fantastic. So that tactile sort of nature of it really, really, for me, is a big sort of selling point for it, and that accessible theme. There's lots of strategic decisions. This game has very, very little luck in it. There's a little bit of variation in terms of when the different action spaces become available. Very little. You know, you've got 3 action spaces. They might come up in order ABC or ACB or whatever, but they're going to come up at roughly the same time. There's a little bit of variation in when the harvests happen. You'll have a certain number of harvests throughout the game, but it is randomized when they occur. But other than that, essentially everything's laid out in front of you and you make the best of what you can see. The slight downside of that is there's not going to be that much variety between games, but the variety comes from what the other players do and how that interacts with you and how that prevents you from doing stuff yourself. What it does mean is that the solitaire game eventually, I think, will become tired because you're doing the same thing. You've got everything laid out exactly the same, and you know, it's ultimately you do as well as you can, and there'll come a point where you go, well, I've done this now. But that said, most games don't even have a solitaire option, and this one does, and it works well. So that's good too. Just to talk a little bit about which other games this is like. I mean, the obvious one to compare it to is Agricola, which is essentially the same game, just with tweaks and alterations and that sort of thing. This obviously predates it. This is a fantastic game, Agricola, absolutely brilliant. For me, this is the best sort of the modern board games that I've played, and I know that everybody doesn't agree with that, but for me this is fantastic. This has got a lot more variability in it than Caverna, because it's got a ton of cards and you only have a certain number of those cards in each game, and so every game you've got a different focus to the last game. Some people don't like that. Some people find that overcomplicates things, but for me, Agricola has huge variety, almost infinite replayability. Again, packed full of tactile components. It's a fantastic game, Agricola. And as you start to add in the expansions, Farmers of the Moor here, which introduces horses and forests and peat and fuel and all sorts of other stuff, extra actions, and the Goodies expansion, which introduces all the little wooden animals and a bunch of cards and, you know, neat extra sort of playing boards and that sort of thing. And then you've got all the sort of individual card decks, so these give extra cards. This is the Belgium deck, you know, and what have I got here? Netherlands deck, So these all give even more variability to Agricola. Now, Caverna plays a bit like a mix of Agricola with Farmers of the Moor, and also a little bit of these other games sort of thrown in there as well. So, a little bit of Le Havre and a little bit of Ora et Labora. I don't have Ora et Labora. These games used to be called the Harvest Trilogy. So the Harvest Trilogy was Le Havre, Lave, I can't pronounce it, and Agricola, and At the Gates of Loyang. This was the Harvest Trilogy until Ora et Labora came along, and then suddenly it became 4, and then we had a 2-player version of Agricola, all creatures big and small, which is a fantastic short half-hour version of Agricola, which has a lot of influence on Caverna. Actually, Caverna does feel like it's got a lot of all creatures big and small in there as well, in terms of those little tiles that you place around. That's a good little game, all creatures big and small. And then we've got Le Havre, the Inland Port, which again is a 2-player version of Le Havre, small, quick, easy to play. So suddenly this Harvest, well, I say suddenly, it's been the last couple of years, this Harvest Trilogy has become a Harvest family, and every single game in there, I mean, I haven't played Ora et Labora, the others are absolute classics. Brilliant, brilliant games. Brilliant games. This one, At the Gates of Loyang, is underrated. Criminally underrated. It's a fantastic game. Really, really good. This one is all about the growing of vegetables, harvesting of vegetables, trading of vegetables, supplying customers. There's a lot of card drafting in it, but it focuses on the vegetable and sort of wheat aspect that you see in Agricola, really focuses in on that. It's a simpler game than the others, but brilliant 2-player game. Not so good with 3 or 4, but brilliant 2-player game. And brilliant 1-player game as well, good solitaire game. Le Havre is all about placing buildings and using those buildings and gathering resources and converting resources into other things. There's more interaction in Le Havre than in the others, because when you use a building, it's going to have an effect on another player as well. But the strategy is a bit more focused. It pushes you in one direction, so you don't have quite you've got a huge diversity of choices, but ultimately you're going one way, which is not true in a game like Caverna, for example. But Le Havre, again, great game. And Ora et Labora, I'm told, feels most like Le Havre, a development of Le Havre with elements of Agricola put in there as well. So those are the other games that you might want to look at if you're considering a game in this sort of genre, and really Uwe Rosenberg has carved out a whole genre of his own with these Harvest games. I don't think Caverna has replaced Agricola. It feels like an alternate version of Agricola, something to play for variety. If you've played a bit of Agricola, well, let's play a bit of Caverna. It's the same way that I use Farmers of the Moor. I don't play it every time I play Agricola, but sometimes I'll add it in. Sometimes now I think I'll play Caverna instead of playing Agricola. And it's quite a nice option to have, but I don't think it's completely replaced Agricola, as some other reviewers have already suggested. That said, it is as good as the other reviewers are saying. It's a really good game. I'm trying to think if there are any downsides to it. The sort of things that people used to complain about with Agricola, some of those things have gone. So no longer do we have to worry about it being stressful. It's not. There's still some thematic sort of problems, little things that don't make sense, all that stuff about, well, why if I take this space, thematically, why can I not have a baby at the same time as he has a baby, or whatever. That stuff's still in there. There's not that much player interaction in this, which is perhaps a bit of a shame. There's still that sort of aggressive blocking tactic that you can do, and some people didn't like that in the previous game, so they won't like that in this either. One problem with some of the tiles, an infinite loop has already been discovered, where if you get 4 of the tiles and put them all together, which is quite a feat to achieve, then you can generate infinite points. That's a shame, but it's a minor thing. Okay, you can change a rule. Okay, I've got about 5 different alternate rules that I could use, and I just discussed them at the beginning of the game, and I'm practically sure the designer will come up with a alternate rule for that one of those tiles that will sort that out very soon. He's already talking on the internet about what he's going to do, so I don't think it's a problem that should make you stay away from the game. It's a minor thing. There's so many of those tiles. You know, basically just don't do it. Don't use that infinite loop, and it's fine. Any other downsides to the game? Well, it's expensive. It's quite intimidating for new players, although the theme will really carry a new player through. It does tell a story, you know, it just all makes sense, and so that's really helpful, and that's what makes the game actually quite accessible, even though it looks daunting at a first glance. And when I'm talking about theme here, this is a really thematic game, but not in the sense of the sort of American thematic games where you go out fighting. Here, we're developing weapons, but they're not really weapons. You know, we use our weapons to go on an expedition and find ourselves some grain or a vegetable. You know, we're not going out and fighting with other dwarves. That option isn't in there. So when I'm talking about this being a thematic game, what I mean is it tells us a gentle story, a simple story, quite a slow story. But you can see something develop in front of you, and it looks like what it is. It looks like a toy farm that you're developing in front of you, and so it is thematic in that sense, not in the American thematic game sense. Yeah, Caverna is as good as everyone's saying it is. Well worth you getting a copy if you're interested, and also have a look at those other games if you haven't played them, because you've got a world of fantastic games ahead of you if you get into Le Havre and Loyang and Agricola and the expansions and the two-player versions and all of that. It's a fantastic world of games.